The library fell silent the moment Niccolo Fabri raised his hand, and in that stillness, every man in the room understood that power wasn't measured by volume, but by the weight of a single gesture. The shelves towered like sentinels around them, holding secrets in leather bindings that had witnessed generations of similar conversations, similar promises made in shadows. Outside, Providence stretched across its ancient hills, the Atlantic wind carrying salt and whispers through streets that remembered when this city was built on trade routes and unspoken agreements. The night pressed against windows framed by curtains heavy enough to muffle screams, though nothing so crude had happened here in years. Elisa Corelli moved along the far wall with practiced invisibility, her cloth barely making sound against the mahogany surface as she worked. She had learned years ago that silence was a language of its own in houses like this, where men spoke in careful tones, and every word carried consequences beyond the room. Her hands knew the rhythm of polishing without thought, leaving her mind free to exist elsewhere, in memories of sun-baked Sicilian hillsides where her grandmother's voice still echoed. The scent of old books mixed with cigar smoke reminded her of nothing from home, yet she had made peace with this displacement. The visiting family sat opposite Niccolo's men, their patriarch positioned at the center like an ancient oak that had weathered too many storms to be moved by wind alone. His face carried the topography of a life lived between two worlds, where honor meant more than contracts and respect was currency that couldn't be printed. The younger men flanking him wore their authority like new suits, still learning how to carry weight without letting it show. They watched Niccolo with eyes that measured everything, calculating distances between words, and searching for weaknesses in his composure. Niccolo's voice cut through the air with surgical precision, discussing territories and percentages as if they were discussing weather patterns rather than the architecture of power itself. His eyes never stayed still, cataloging every reaction, every micro-expression that might reveal intention or weakness. At 28, he had inherited an empire built on foundations he never questioned, and maintained it through a combination of inherited respect and carefully demonstrated capability. The men who served him did so because their fathers had served his father, creating chains of loyalty that felt more like destiny than choice. A crystal decanter sat between the two groups, amber liquid catching lamplight and throwing fractured patterns across the table's polished surface. No one had touched it yet, as if the first man to reach for a glass would be admitting some unnamed weakness. The patriarch's eyes drifted occasionally toward the window, where Providence's old street lamps created pools of yellow light in the darkness below. He had known this city when it still pretended to be something other than what it was, before the polite fiction of legitimacy had worn quite so thin. Elisa reached the bookshelf nearest the gathering, her presence so unobtrusive that most men had forgotten she existed within minutes of her entering. She understood this erasure, had cultivated it as deliberately as a gardener tends specific flowers while letting others fade into background green. One of Niccolo's advisors leaned forward, his words dropping into the conversation like stones into still water, creating ripples that changed the shape of what had been discussed before. The visiting family's second son shifted in his chair, a movement small enough to be unconscious but large enough to be noted. Niccolo caught it, filing the observation away in the mental catalog he maintained of everyone's tells and patterns. He had learned young that survival meant reading people better than they read themselves, anticipating moves before they were made. The clock on the mantel marked time with discrete clicks, each second another small eternity in negotiations, where pauses meant as much as words. Elisa dusted the lower shelves now, her movements creating a soft rhythm that somehow made the silence between statements feel less oppressive. She had worked in this house for 8 months, long enough to understand its rhythms, but not long enough to be truly seen by the men who moved through it like sharks through dark water. They existed in one reality, while she inhabited another, two worlds occupying the same space but rarely touching. The patriarch finally spoke, his voice carrying an accent that hadn't been softened by decades in America, each word weighted with consideration. His statement shifted something in the room's energy, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to open. Niccolo responded immediately, his Italian flawless and formal, the kind taught by expensive tutors who had never set foot in the villages where the language was born. He laid out terms with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, whose world had always bent to accommodate his expectations. Elisa moved toward the side table where empty glasses waited to be collected, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the Persian rug that had cost more than her entire year's salary. As she reached for a glass, one of the younger visiting men asked her something in rapid Italian, his tone casual, almost dismissive. She answered without thinking, her words carrying the cadence of her childhood, the particular melody that belonged to villages clinging to Sicilian mountainsides, where Italian was something you learned for school, but never truly spoke at home. Her voice was quiet, respectful, offering the simple information he had requested about where to find the washroom. But the accent hung in the air like smoke, unmistakable to anyone who knew the difference between the polished Italian of Rome and the ancient dialect that predated the country itself. Niccolo's head turned slowly, his attention shifting from the negotiation to this woman he had barely registered as human until this moment. The room held its breath without knowing why, some instinct telling every man present that something significant had just occurred, even if they couldn't name it. Niccolo's eyes fixed on Elisa with the same intensity he brought to examining contracts, as if she had suddenly become a document requiring translation. She froze with the glass in her hand, recognizing too late that she had made herself visible in a space where invisibility was her only protection. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her memory, about keeping your head down and your mouth shut in houses where power lived. "Speak proper Italian next time," Niccolo said, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw blood without breaking skin. The words fell into the silence like a verdict, transforming her moment of visibility into something meant to shame, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy of this room. A ripple of laughter moved through his men, not loud but present, the kind of amusement that comes from watching someone else be diminished. It was the sound of power reinforcing itself, of boundaries being drawn and redrawn with casual cruelty that didn't even recognize itself as such. The glass in Elisa's hand caught the lamplight, throwing small rainbows across her fingers as she stood perfectly still in the wake of Niccolo's correction. Every eye in the room had found her now, pulled from important matters to witness this small theater of humiliation. The patriarch's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. She could have apologized, could have lowered her eyes and retreated into the invisibility that had protected her until now. Instead, her fingers tightened slightly on the glass, her grandmother's voice rising louder than fear in her mind, speaking of dignity that couldn't be stripped away by men who had forgotten where they came from. The younger men around the table wore smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, performing amusement because their boss had made a joke, and jokes required audiences. They were men who had learned to laugh on command, to mirror the emotions of whoever held the most power in any given room. Niccolo returned his attention to the document spread before him, already dismissing the interaction as resolved, the small disruptions smoothed over and forgotten. He reached for his pen with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that his words would be obeyed. That correction was the same as compliance. But Elisa didn't move toward the door, didn't lower her head, or mumble apologies in the proper Italian he had demanded. Her hand set the glass down with deliberate care, the small sound of crystal meeting wood somehow louder than it should have been. The cloth she had been using lay folded over her arm, and she smoothed it once with her free hand, a gesture that looked like nervousness, but was actually preparation. Her heart beat against her ribs like a bird testing the bars of its cage, but her breathing remained steady. She had spent 8 months being invisible, 8 months swallowing words that tasted like ash, 8 months pretending that silence was the same as peace. But there were some things that couldn't be swallowed anymore, some moments where the cost of speaking became less than the cost of staying quiet. The air in the library seemed to thicken, molecules pressing closer together as Elisa drew breath to speak. Her eyes remained fixed on the table she had been cleaning, not meeting Niccolo's gaze, not challenging anyone directly, but not retreating either. When the words came, they came in the language her grandmother had whispered to her at night, the dialect that had survived invasions and empires and the slow erosion of time itself. Meglio parare l'arma con la lingua finta. The Sicilian rolled off her tongue like water finding its ancient path down mountainsides, each syllable carrying weight that polished Italian could never hold. It was the voice of stone villages and olive groves, of women who had buried husbands and raised children alone, of survival that looked like surrender until you understood what it cost. Niccolo's pen stopped moving across the page, suspended in mid-signature as if the ink itself had frozen. The younger men's smiles died like candles in wind, their faces shifting from amusement to confusion, to something that might have been recognition of their own error. Better to speak with soul than with a fake tongue. The translation existed somewhere in the space between her words and their understanding, not needing to be spoken aloud to be felt. The patriarch's weathered hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, slowly curled into fists, Not with anger, but with something deeper. One of the visiting family's men leaned forward slightly, his eyes widening with the shock of hearing his childhood's language in this American mansion, where everything had been polished smooth and made acceptable. The dialect was a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed, opening doors to rooms he thought he had sealed forever. The clock's ticking suddenly seemed obscene in its persistence, marking time that should have stopped entirely for a moment like this. Nicolo's eyes remained fixed on the documents before him, but his stillness had changed quality, becoming the stillness of a predator that had just realized its prey might have teeth. Elisa's hands remained steady as she picked up the glass again, continuing her work as if speaking truth to power was no different than polishing crystal. Her heart still raced, but her body moved with the same practiced efficiency it always had, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The patriarch rose from his chair, with the slow deliberation of age and absolute authority, the kind of movement that couldn't be rushed or stopped once begun. Every man in the room turned toward him, including Nicolo, whose expression finally shifted from dismissal to attention that bordered on concern. The old man's eyes were fixed on Elisa, and in them was recognition that went beyond language, beyond the immediate moment into something older and more fundamental. He had heard his mother's voice in her words, his aunt's, every woman who had ever stood in a kitchen and spoken truth while men pretended they ruled the world. He said nothing, but his standing was a statement louder than any words could have been, a physical manifestation of respect that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. The younger men scrambled to their feet in response, following his lead without understanding it, their bodies responding to hierarchy even as their minds struggled to catch up. Nicolo remained seated for a heartbeat longer than appropriate, trapped between maintaining his authority and acknowledging what the patriarch's gesture meant. When he finally stood, it was with controlled grace, but something in his face had changed. Some certainty had developed its first crack. The room existed in suspension, every breath held, every thought frozen in the moment between Elisa's words and whatever would come next. The books surrounding them seemed to lean in closer, as if centuries of recorded knowledge recognized that something was being written here that mattered more than the deals being negotiated. Nicolo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath skin that had never been struck but had learned tension from watching violence happen to others. He looked at the patriarch still standing, at his own men, uncertain whether to rise or remain seated, at this woman who had somehow shifted the entire foundation of his carefully constructed authority. The visiting family's patriarch spoke then, his voice carrying the gravel of age and cigarettes, but also the clarity of absolute conviction. Ida parla como a mia nana. She speaks like my grandmother. The words were Sicilian, pure and uncompromising, a declaration that couldn't be translated into anything softer. One of Nicolo's advisors opened his mouth to respond, to smooth over this disruption with diplomatic language and careful maneuvering, but Nicolo raised his hand in a gesture that commanded silence more effectively than shouting ever could. His eyes never left Elisa, studying her as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the invisible servant with this person who had somehow become the center of the room's gravity. She met his gaze then, finally, and in her eyes was nothing like defiance or triumph, only a quiet dignity that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. She had not meant to challenge him, had not planned this moment, but having arrived here she would not pretend it hadn't happened. The patriarch lowered himself back into his chair, with the same deliberation he had used to rise, and this too was a statement. A signal that something had been acknowledged and could now proceed differently than before. His men followed his lead, settling into their seats with new awareness of the woman still standing by the side table. Nicolo's breathing changed, became something conscious rather than automatic, as if he was learning a new rhythm that his body didn't quite know yet. The power in the room hadn't shifted to Elisa. She had no interest in that currency, but it had been redistributed in ways that made his previous certainty impossible to maintain. The meeting concluded an hour later with handshakes that carried different weight than they would have before Elisa's words had rearranged the room's understanding of itself. Nicolo walked the visiting family to the mansion's entrance, his posture perfect and his words carefully chosen, but something in his performance had become visible as performance for the first time. The patriarch paused at the threshold, turning back to offer Nicolo a nod that somehow managed to be both respectful and instructive. A casa ci tieni memoria, e ciù forti di una casa ci tieni sulle mura. A house that holds memory is stronger than a house that holds only walls. He didn't explain the Sicilian, didn't translate it into something more palatable. Niccolo understood enough to feel the criticism embedded in what might have sounded like a compliment, the suggestion that his empire had been built on foundations he hadn't properly honored. He returned the nod with precision that masked the anger beginning to simmer beneath his carefully maintained surface. When the heavy door finally closed, and the sound of cars faded down the hill toward Providence's sleeping streets, Niccolo stood alone in the foyer that suddenly felt too large. The chandelier above threw shadows that moved with each small current of air, making the space feel inhabited by more than just furniture and expensive art. He found himself walking back toward the library without conscious decision, his feet following a path his mind hadn't yet approved. The room still smelled of cigar smoke, and the particular tension that negotiations always left behind, molecules of dominance and compromise hanging in the air like invisible residue. Elisa had finished her work and departed through the servants' entrance, leaving behind surfaces that gleamed with her attention and no other trace of her existence. Niccolo stood where she had stood when she spoke, trying to understand how someone so thoroughly erased could have become so suddenly undeniable. His reflection caught in the darkened window, and he studied it as if looking at a stranger, seeing the expensive suit and perfect grooming, and the face that had learned young never to show uncertainty. Behind his reflection, Providence stretched out in layers of shadow and amber streetlight, the city that had raised him to believe power was something you took and kept, through strength alone. Sleep came reluctantly that night, interrupted by dreams where his father stood in the library shaking his head with disappointment, though about what exactly Niccolo couldn't determine. He woke at dawn feeling as if he had run miles rather than simply lying still, his body aching with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The morning routine proceeded as always. Coffee brought to his room at precisely 6:30. Newspapers arranged by his place at the breakfast table, his schedule presented for approval. But Niccolo found himself listening for something beneath the routine, some sound that would indicate Elisa's presence in the house. He saw her first through the breakfast room's doorway, moving through the hall beyond with her arms full of linens that needed changing. She didn't glance his way, didn't acknowledge his existence any more than she ever had, and somehow this ordinariness felt like rejection. His coffee tasted bitter despite being prepared exactly as he always took it, and the newspaper articles about city council meetings and business acquisitions seemed to be written in a language he had forgotten how to read properly. Everything felt slightly wrong, as if the world had shifted 3 inches to the left, while he wasn't paying attention. The day's scheduled meetings proceeded with their usual efficiency: territory discussions with his captains, financial reviews with his accountants, the endless maintenance of an empire that required constant attention to keep from developing cracks. But Niccolo caught himself distracted, his mind returning to the library and the moment when his authority had been questioned by someone who hadn't even been trying to challenge him. One of his advisors noticed his divided attention and paused mid-sentence, waiting with the patient concern of someone who knew better than to directly comment on his boss's state of mind. Niccolo waved him to continue, forcing focus back to matters of shipments and percentages and the architecture of profit. But when he returned home that evening and saw Elisa descending the main staircase with cleaning supplies, he found himself watching her movement with attention he had never granted before. She carried herself with unconscious grace, each step placed with certainty, her body navigating space as if she had been born understanding exactly how much room she needed. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second as she reached the bottom step, and in that brief connection, Niccolo felt something shift in his chest, some wall developing its first hairline fracture. She looked away immediately, continuing toward the kitchen wing, leaving him standing in the foyer feeling absurdly disappointed by her lack of reaction. The library called to him again that night, though he told himself it was simply his preferred space for reviewing documents that required careful attention. He sat in the chair where he had sat during the meeting, the leather still holding the shape of his body, the desk lamp throwing the same pool of yellow light across mahogany that had witnessed his humiliation. Humiliation. He tested the word in his mind, trying to determine if that's what he had actually felt, or if it was something more complex, something he didn't have adequate vocabulary to name. The books surrounding him seemed to mock his lack of understanding, all these volumes filled with words and none of them offering the explanation he needed. Morning light filtered through the mansion's tall windows in geometric patterns that shifted as the sun climbed higher, marking time in gold rectangles that crawled across floors Elisa had polished until they reflected light like dark water. She moved through the house's rhythm with the same efficiency she always had, but something in her awareness had sharpened, some antenna now tuned to frequencies she had previously ignored. Niccolo began appearing in rooms where he had no practical reason to be. The second-floor hallway when she was dusting portraits. The conservatory when she watered plants that his mother had cultivated before her death. He never spoke to her directly, never acknowledged her presence with more than the absence of acknowledgement he had always offered. But his attention was a physical thing she could feel against her skin. She understood what he was doing without him needing to articulate it. This careful study that men of power conducted when they encountered something that didn't fit their existing categories. He was trying to solve her like an equation, to reduce her to components he could name, and therefore control. The other staff noticed his new pattern, and drew their own conclusions, whispered theories exchanged in the kitchen over morning coffee, about what the boss's interest might mean for the quiet Sicilian woman who had never caused trouble. Their eyes followed her with mixture of envy and concern, wondering if she understood the danger of being seen. But Elisa had grown up in a village where being female meant learning to navigate male attention like sailors learned to read weather, understanding which storms could be weathered and which required immediate shelter. She recognized Niccolò's observation as something different than the predatory interest she had learned to deflect, something more confused, and therefore potentially more dangerous. 3 days after the meeting, she encountered him in the library while returning books to their proper shelves, volumes he had pulled for some research and abandoned without reshielding. He sat at the desk with papers spread before him, but his eyes tracked her movement with focus that had nothing to do with documents requiring signature. "You've worked here 8 months, he said suddenly, the words dropping into silence like stones into still water. His voice carried no particular inflection, just statement of fact that somehow felt like question. Elisa paused with a leather-bound volume in her hands, its weight familiar and grounding against the strangeness of being directly addressed. "Yes, sir." Her English carried the same accent her Italian did, melody shaped by different rules than the sharp consonants of American speech. He waited as if expecting her to elaborate, to fill the silence with explanations or apologies or whatever it was he thought women in her position should offer men in his. When she simply returned to her task, sliding the book into its designated space with careful precision, his expression shifted to something that might have been frustration, or might have been curiosity about his own frustration. Where in Sicily? The question came after a pause long enough that she had assumed the conversation was finished, her attention already moving to the next volume needing replacement. "A village you wouldn't know, sir. Near Corleone." She offered the information without embellishment, understanding that this too was a kind of test, though what exactly he was testing for remained unclear. Something flickered across his face at the village name, recognition of the reputation that preceded any mention of that region, the associations with blood and code and a particular flavor of honor that Americans had turned into mythology. His grandfather had come from somewhere near there, she knew from overheard conversations, though his family had spent 3 generations pretending their roots were planted in more respectable soil. "My grandmother spoke the way you speak," he said finally, the admission costing him something she could see in the tension of his jaw, before she learned better. Elisa turned to face him fully then, the remaining books forgotten in her arms, her eyes meeting his with directness that probably violated every rule about how staff should interact with employers. "She didn't learn better, sir. She learned different. Better and different aren't the same thing." The correction was gentle but unmistakable, offered in tone that somehow managed to be both respectful and completely unwilling to concede the point. Niccolò's hands flattened against the desk as if he needed to brace himself against the simplicity of her logic, the way it cut through generations of his family's careful self-invention. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elisa had already turned back to her work, the moment of direct engagement closed as decisively as a door. She finished shelving the remaining books with movements that suggested his presence had already been forgotten, though her heart beat fast enough to make her breath shallow. When she left the library 10 minutes later, Niccolò remained at the desk with his papers still unsigned, staring at the space where she had stood, as if it contained answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. The afternoon light had shifted, gold rectangles now climbing the western wall, time moving forward whether he was ready or not. That evening, he canceled a meeting with his accountants, and instead sat in the conservatory where his mother's plants grew wild and beautiful under Elisa's care. He watched through the window as she crossed the courtyard below, her arms full of laundry that needed hanging, her figure small against the backdrop of Providence's layered architecture. The days developed a pattern that was not quite routine, but not quite chaos either, something in between where Niccolò found himself arranging his schedule around glimpses of Elisa's presence. He told himself it was simply curiosity about someone who had managed to surprise him, intellectual interest in understanding how she had achieved what no one else had dared attempt. But late at night, when the mansion settled into its sleeping rhythms, and he lay awake, listening to the house breathe, he knew the truth was more complicated than curiosity. She had opened a door in him that he hadn't known was locked, revealed rooms in himself that he had been taught to wall off and ignore. His captains noticed the change in him, though they couldn't name its source. The way his attention sometimes drifted during discussions that should have commanded his complete focus. They exchanged glances that carried concern about their boss's distraction, wondering if some threat they hadn't identified was consuming his thoughts. Niccolo's decisions remained sound, his judgment still sharp on matters of territory and profit, and the careful balance of fear and respect that kept his empire stable. But something in his certainty had softened at its edges, become permeable to doubt in ways that would have been unthinkable a month before. He began leaving books open on the library desk, volumes about Sicily's history and culture, its dialect and customs, and the particular codes of honor that had governed life in villages where government was something that happened elsewhere. The pages accumulated his fingerprints and occasional notes in margins, evidence of study being conducted in private. Elisa saw the books but never commented, simply worked around them as she worked around everything else that belonged to the house's official business. But sometimes when she was certain she was alone, she would pause to read what he had been reading, tracing the same passages his eyes had traveled, understanding that he was trying to build a bridge towards something he couldn't yet articulate. The patriarch's words had planted themselves in Niccolo's mind like seeds in fertile soil, growing into questions about what his family had sacrificed in their climb toward American respectability. His father had taught him to speak Italian like a Roman, to dress like old money even though their money was 3 generations fresh, to erase anything that suggested they had come from somewhere specific, rather than emerging fully formed into power. But Elisa carried her origins like someone carrying water from a sacred well, precious and unashamed. And in her lack of apology was an implicit criticism of everything his family had worked to become. She suggested through her mere existence that something valuable had been lost in translation, that the language his grandmother had forgotten might have contained wisdom worth preserving. One afternoon, Niccolo found himself in the kitchen where staff took their meals, a space he normally never entered because crossing that threshold suggested interest in the machinery rather than just its outputs. The cook startled at his appearance, nearly dropping the vegetables she was chopping, her face going pale with assumption that she had done something wrong. "I'm looking for Miss Corelli," he said, the formality of using her surname feeling strange in his mouth when he had spent months thinking of her simply as the Sicilian girl, if he thought of her at all. The cook pointed toward the garden with a knife still in her hand, her relief at not being the subject of his visit visible in how her shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch. Niccolo nodded his thanks and moved toward the door, aware that this conversation would be all over the staff quarters within the hour, transformed into speculation and theory. He found Elisa among the herb garden his mother had planted 20 years before, her hands working soil around basil plants that needed thinning. She wore gloves that had seen better days, their fingers stained with seasons of earth, and her hair was tied back with a simple ribbon that had probably cost less than the buttons on his shirt. She looked up at his approach but didn't rise, didn't perform the deference that others offered automatically to his presence. "The basil will be ready for cutting next week," she said, as if he had come to inquire about kitchen supplies rather than for reasons he couldn't quite name. "I wanted to apologize," Niccolo heard himself say, the words arriving without his conscious decision to speak them, "for what I said during the meeting. It was disrespectful." Elisa's hands paused in their work, dirt falling from her gloves in dark crumbles that dissolved into the soil below. She studied him with eyes that seemed older than her years, weighing his words for sincerity, or calculating whether honesty was worth the risk of offering it. "You weren't disrespectful to me, sir. You were disrespectful to your grandmother, to everyone who came before you, speaking the way they knew how to speak." Her voice remained gentle despite the criticism embedded in observation, offering him truth without malice. The statement hit him with physical force, like taking a punch he hadn't seen coming, knocking breath from his lungs and leaving him struggling to regain equilibrium. No one spoke to him this way, with honesty unvarnished by fear or strategy, words meant to illuminate rather than manipulate. He stood there in the garden with afternoon sun warm on his shoulders, and the smell of herbs rising from earth she had tended, feeling more lost than he had felt since childhood. The empire he commanded, the respect he demanded, the power he wielded, all of it suddenly seemed beside the point, currency that couldn't purchase what he was beginning to realize he wanted. 3 weeks passed before the visiting family returned. 3 weeks during which Niccolo found himself practicing Sicilian phrases in the privacy of his bedroom like a schoolboy preparing for examinations. He used the books as guides, but found the written words inadequate for capturing the music he remembered from his grandmother's voice before she had been trained into silence. The house staff prepared for the meeting with the same efficiency they brought to all such occasions, but Elisa moved through her preparations with awareness that this gathering would be different than the last. She had been asked specifically by Niccolo to be present in the library during the negotiations, a request delivered through the head housekeeper, because he still hadn't learned how to speak to her directly about anything that mattered. The invitation itself was unprecedented, elevating her from invisible servant to someone whose presence was specifically required, and the other staff didn't know whether to be envious or concerned on her behalf. She accepted the assignment with the same calm she brought to everything, though her hands trembled slightly as she pressed her uniform that evening. The visiting family arrived at dusk, their cars climbing the hill toward the mansion through streets where gas lamps were just beginning to flicker to life against the gathering darkness. Providence looked particularly beautiful in that hour, suspended between day and night, its old bones showing through modern skin. The patriarch emerged from the lead car moving with the same deliberate authority he had displayed during their first meeting, but his eyes swept immediately toward the mansion's entrance with what might have been anticipation. His sons flanked him in formation that spoke of protection and succession, the younger generation learning how power was transferred through observation and proximity. Niccolo met them at the door himself, rather than sending his second, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by any of the men present. He wore a suit that cost more than most people earned in 6 months, but something in how he carried it had changed, become less performance and more simple fact of his daily armor. The library had been arranged differently this time, with chairs positioned in a circle, rather than opposite sides of a table, the geography of the room suggesting collaboration, rather than confrontation. Crystal glasses already held amber liquid, and the air smelled of furniture polish and the particular tension that always preceded important conversations. Elisa entered carrying a tray of small glasses filled with espresso, her movements economical and assured despite the weight of attention that shifted toward her the moment she appeared. The patriarch's face transformed at the sight of her, lines rearranging themselves into something that resembled joy, as if she had confirmed some theory he had been hoping to prove. She served each man with practiced grace, starting with the patriarch out of instinct for hierarchy that needed no instruction, then moving through his sons, and finally to Niccolo's men. When she reached Niccolo himself, their eyes met for a heartbeat longer than necessary, some wordless communication passing between them that the room registered without understanding. "Grazie, signora," Niccolo said, his Italian carrying less polish than before, consonants softened toward the shapes his grandmother would have recognized. The formality of calling her signora rather than signorina was deliberate, offering respect that transcended her unmarried status, and acknowledged something deeper. Elisa's lips curved in the smallest suggestion of a smile, acknowledgement without commentary, and she inclined her head in response, before stepping back to her position near the door. She didn't leave the room as she had during the previous meeting, instead remaining present as witness to whatever would unfold. The negotiations began with discussion of territories and cities Elisa had never visited, percentages of profits from businesses she could barely imagine, the architecture of cooperation between families who had been enemies in the old country. But the language of the discussion had shifted. Italian now mixed freely with Sicilian phrases that carried meanings standard Italian couldn't quite capture. The patriarch leaned back in his chair with espresso cup cradled in his weathered hands, watching Niccolo with eyes that measured growth rather than threat. "Vidisti como a terra cangia," he observed to no one in particular. "You've seen how the land changes." The words applied to Providence and its evolution, but also to something more personal that everyone in the room understood without explanation. Niccolo nodded slowly, accepting the observation as the compliment it was intended to be, recognition that he had been willing to learn rather than simply defend his ignorance. "Cu tempu, tutti le cose ponu cagnari." With time, all things can change. His Sicilian was imperfect but sincere, each word placed with care of someone learning to speak truth in a language his family had tried to forget. One of the younger visiting men glanced toward Elisa with expression that suggested he understood her role in this transformation, that he recognized the particular alchemy that could occur when power encountered authenticity, and chose learning over dominance. His father caught the look and smiled, some private satisfaction at seeing the patterns repeat themselves across generations. The meeting concluded 2 hours later with agreements that benefited both families, terms that would have seemed impossible during their first encounter when respect had been performance rather than genuine currency. The men rose and shook hands with warmth that surprised them, discovering that alliance felt different when built on foundations of mutual recognition rather than mere strategic necessity. As the visiting family prepared to depart, the patriarch paused beside Elisa, where she stood near the library's entrance, her presence having gone mostly unremarked upon, but entirely essential to everything that had transpired. He spoke to her in rapid Sicilian, words meant only for her ears, and whatever he said brought color to her cheeks and brightness to her eyes that Niccolò had never seen before. The house settled into new rhythms after the meeting, invisible adjustments in how space was navigated and respect distributed that the staff registered without fully understanding. Niccolò began taking his morning coffee in the conservatory rather than the breakfast room, a shift that happened to coincide with when Elisa tended the plants there. They didn't speak during these encounters, at least not with words, but something was being communicated through the careful way he moved to give her access to the watering can, the manner in which she made sure fresh flowers appeared on his desk without him needing to request them. It was a language of gestures and proximity, building vocabulary where none had existed before. His men noticed that their boss had become more patient in meetings, less quick to anger when plans encountered obstacles or subordinates made mistakes that required correction. They attributed it to maturity or strategy, not understanding that he was learning from someone who navigated her entire existence with patience, because impatience was a luxury she had never been able to afford. The books in the library multiplied, volumes about Sicilian history and culture joined by poetry and dialect, and memoirs from people who had lived the kind of life his family had erased from their official story. Niccolò read late into the night, trying to recover what had been deliberately lost, building bridges toward understanding that felt both like coming home and discovering foreign country. Elisa found notes sometimes, tucked into the books she was shelving, questions written in his careful handwriting about phrases or customs he didn't understand. She would write answers on separate paper and leave them on his desk, her responses always precise and somehow more informative than the volumes he was studying, because she was explaining life rather than documenting it. October arrived, and Providence began its transformation into autumn, leaves turning colors that reminded Niccolò of rust and gold, and the particular shade of light that filtered through the library windows at sunset. The air carried hints of coming cold, that particular quality of northeastern autumn that made you grateful for shelter and warm drinks. The household prepared for another gathering, this one marking a birthday for one of Niccolò's captains, the kind of celebration that mixed business and family in ways that outsiders never quite understood. The main rooms were opened and polished, furniture moved to accommodate dancing, the kitchen staff working overtime to prepare food for an army of guests who would arrive expecting abundance. Elisa worked alongside the other staff with her usual efficiency, but Niccolò noticed how her hands moved differently when arranging flowers for the dining room, selecting blooms with artistic eye, rather than simple functionality. She created centerpieces that somehow captured autumn's melancholy beauty, arrangements that made grown men pause to look more closely. The guests began arriving at 7, flooding the mansion with noise and energy that transformed its usual quiet dignity into something more vibrant and chaotic. Niccolò moved through the crowd receiving respect and offering greetings, his performance flawless as always, but his attention kept drifting toward the edges of the gathering where staff moved like shadows, keeping everything flowing smoothly. He saw Elisa in the hallway carrying a tray of empty glasses back toward the kitchen, her figure small against the backdrop of people celebrating their power and prosperity. Something in the contrast made his chest tighten, awareness of all the ways his world was built on the invisibility of people like her, people who made everything possible while receiving none of the credit. Later, when the party had reached its peak and the dancing had begun, Niccolò stepped out onto the terrace where the autumn air provided relief from the overheated interior. He stood looking out over Providence's lights. The city spread below like jewelry scattered on dark velvet, and didn't hear Elisa approach until she was beside him with his coat that he had left inside. "You'll catch cold, sir," she said quietly, offering the garment with the same practical care she brought to all her duties. But there was something different in her voice tonight, some softness that hadn't been there before. He took the coat, but didn't put it on, holding it instead like a shield or possibly a white flag. "Elisa," he said, using her given name for the first time, the syllables feeling both foreign and perfectly right in his mouth. "Will you teach me to speak properly?" The question hung between them in the cold air, meaning more than its surface suggested, asking for permission to continue the education he had begun with books, but needed a living teacher to complete. She studied his face in the dim light spilling from the windows, weighing sincerity against all the reasons to refuse. "Buonasera, Don Niccolo," she said finally, the Sicilian greeting carrying acceptance of his request and acknowledgement of his title in the form his grandmother would have used. "Good evening." The words were simple, but the dialect made them sacred, transformation of casual greeting into something ceremonial. His heart performed complicated gymnastics in his chest, though his face revealed none of this internal chaos. "Buonasera," he repeated, his accent improving even in that brief exchange because he was learning now from the source, rather than from books written by people who had studied from outside. They stood together in the autumn cold, with party noise filtering out around them. Two people from different worlds discovering that language could be a bridge if both sides were willing to walk across it. Providence stretched below them, ancient and modern simultaneously, keeping its secrets the way it always had. When Elisa finally returned inside to continue her work, Niccolo remained on the terrace with his coat still held loosely in his hands, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his existence. The party continued without him, music and laughter, and the business of maintaining power. But for the first time he understood that power was only one kind of strength. Winter arrived early that year, bringing cold that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than descending from the sky, and Providence's old bones ached with it the way elderly residents ached in their joints. The mansion's heating system worked overtime, radiators clanking and hissing like sleeping dragons waking reluctantly to perform their duty. Niccolo's lessons with Elisa became routine over the following weeks. Stolen moments between her duties when he would find her in empty rooms and ask about phrases or customs, building his vocabulary one word at a time. She was patient teacher, correcting his pronunciation without judgment, explaining context that books couldn't capture because they lived in gesture and tone rather than text. His men noticed the change in how he spoke, the way Sicilian phrases had begun infiltrating his Italian, softening its Roman formality into something earthier and more honest. They didn't comment directly, understanding instinctively that this transformation was connected to the quiet woman who had somehow become essential to their boss's daily routine. The other families noticed too, word spreading through networks of connection and communication, that Niccolo Fabri had started speaking like his grandfather again, that he had stopped pretending his people had emerged from nowhere and acknowledged the rocky soil that had grown them. Some viewed it as weakness, this admission of origin, while others recognized it as the particular strength that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. Christmas approached, and the mansion was decorated with evergreen branches that filled the air with pine scent and memories of forests that none of the current residents had ever walked through. Elisa wove the branches into wreaths with hands that knew the patterns from childhood, creating beauty from simple materials because that's what women in her village had always done when celebration required more than they possessed. Niccolo watched her work from the library doorway, observing how her fingers moved with certainty, born from repetition, muscle memory carrying knowledge that couldn't be taught through books or formal instruction. She had tied back her sleeves to keep them clear of pine sap, revealing forearms marked with small scars from years of work that required physical labor. "My grandmother made wreaths like that," he said quietly, the memory surfacing from somewhere deep, a place where his childhood still existed before it had been trained into something more acceptable. She would sing while she worked. Elisa's hands paused briefly, then continued their weaving as she began to hum a melody that Niccolo recognized from some locked room in his memory, a tune his grandmother had sung before she learned to be quiet. The sound filled the space between them, bridge made of music rather than words. He found himself humming along, the tune coming back to him note by note, his voice rusty from disuse but finding its way through the melody like water finding its downhill path. When the song ended, they stood in silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward, two people discovering they spoke the same language of memory and loss. "She would have liked you," Niccolo said finally, the admission costing him something but feeling necessary anyway. "My grandmother, she would have recognized you as kin." Elisa met his eyes directly, the green of her irises catching light from the window and holding it. "Maybe she sent me here," she suggested softly, offering possibility that was either fantasy or faith depending on how you chose to interpret it, to remind you of what you knew before you learned to forget. The statement settled between them with weight of truth that couldn't be argued with, and Niccolo felt something in his chest unlock, some final resistance releasing its hold. He had spent years building walls around parts of himself that didn't fit the image he was supposed to maintain, and this woman had managed to dismantle them not through force, but through simply existing with integrity, intact. Another gathering was scheduled for New Year's Eve, this one bringing together multiple families to mark the year's ending and new beginnings that would arrive with January. The preparation was more elaborate than usual, the mansion transformed into setting worthy of the occasion, every surface polished until it reflected light like water. The visiting patriarch arrived early, claiming age as excuse for avoiding the crush of later crowds, but Niccolo suspected the real reason was desire for conversation, away from the performance that public gatherings required. They sat in the library with glasses of wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, discussing territories and alliances in language that mixed business with philosophy. "You've changed," the old man observed without preamble, his directness a privilege of age and earned respect. "Found something you were missing, maybe, or remembered something you'd forgotten." Niccolo nodded slowly, accepting the observation without deflection or false humility. "I had good teachers," he said simply, the plural encompassing both the woman who had challenged him and the patriarch whose recognition had forced him to question his assumptions. The old man smiled, lines rearranging themselves into expression of satisfaction that went beyond simple pleasure. "A forti nun e cu camanna, ma cu sapi quannu ascutari." The strong one isn't who commands, but who knows when to listen. The Sicilian flowed from him like water from deep wells, carrying wisdom accumulated over decades of surviving in worlds that tried to erase people like him. When the other guests began arriving, transforming the mansion into carnival of celebration and strategic conversation, Niccolo moved through the crowd with grace that had become more genuine and less performed. He greeted each arrival with appropriate respect, conducted business discussions with usual acuity, but something in his presence had shifted toward authenticity that people registered without fully understanding. Elisa worked the edges of the gathering as always, ensuring glasses stayed filled and empty plates were cleared, her presence unmarked by most but essential to everything flowing smoothly. But when she passed near where Niccolo stood talking with his captains, he turned to include her in the conversation with gesture that transformed her from invisible servant to acknowledged person. "Buonasera, Elisa," he said in front of everyone, the Sicilian greeting deliberate and public, declaration of respect that couldn't be misinterpreted. The conversation paused, his men registering this unprecedented acknowledgement, with expressions ranging from surprise to cautious approval. She met his eyes with that characteristic directness that had first unsettled him, inclining her head in response. "Buonasera, Don Niccolo," she replied, her voice carrying quiet dignity that needed no amplification to command attention. The moment stretched between them, something wordless and profound being communicated through syllables and glances. The party continued around them, Providence's powerful elite celebrating another year survived, and new opportunities approaching with January's arrival. But Niccolo remained aware of Elisa's presence with attention that had become habitual. She moved through the crowd like current moving through water, essential but unseen, except by those who knew how to look for it. And he had learned to look. When midnight approached and the countdown began, Niccolo found himself on the terrace again despite the bitter cold, needing air and space away from the performance that celebration required. The city spread below like constellation fallen to earth, lights marking where people made their lives among Providence's ancient streets. Elisa appeared beside him with his coat again, this tradition having established itself between them, her presence both expected and somehow always surprising. She didn't speak, simply stood looking out over the city that had become home for both of them, despite coming from such different places. "Thank you," Niccolo said as the count reached its final numbers, fireworks beginning to bloom over the harbor in colors that briefly turned night into day, "for teaching me to speak again." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes was understanding that went beyond language, recognition of all the ways he had transformed since that first meeting when his arrogance had tried to diminish her. "You already knew how to speak, Don Niccolo. You just needed to remember that some words matter more than others." The new year arrived with explosions of light and sound, Providence celebrating survival and continuation, while Niccolo and Elisa stood together in the cold, two people who had found unexpected common language in a world that tried to keep them separate. Below them, the city that had raised them both, him to power, her to service, continued its ancient breathing, keeping secrets and witnessing transformations it would never speak aloud. Inside, the party would continue for hours more, Business being conducted between toasts and strategic alliances being formed on dance floors, the machinery of power maintaining itself through celebration and careful negotiation. But out here in the cold, with providence stretched below like promise or threat depending on your perspective, two people stood learning that respect was a language spoken through actions more than words, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply listen when someone spoke truth in their own tongue. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you stories about respect, dignity, and the unexpected ways people find common ground. See you in the next one.